They'd have a problem with him being a little gruesome, but he's such a curiosity and fun to think who he might have been or what he did.
Do you know who found him?
He was found by a couple of traveling cowboys, and he's a complete mystery. There's been a number of people that have tried to find his identity, and he never cleared up any murder mysteries or missing persons or anything like that. He gets a lot of attention. I think he even had a Valentine one time. But he's definitely somebody that one of our exhibits that's the most popular. Well, we had Sylvester for a number of years, and a fellow was traveling through the shop and contacted us and said, "I noticed you have a mummy out there on display. Would you like to have a female to go with it?" And next thing you know, we purchased a female mummy. Sylvia's a bit more fragile than Sylvester, and so she always stays in her glass cage. We don't take her out for fear that she might get damaged.
So which one has the most admirers?
I think probably Sylvester is our more popular mummy. We've had him quite a bit longer, and I suppose just by looking at him he evokes more curiosity.
Do they have much of a social life?
I think they're actually pretty quiet. They don't get around much anymore.
There's nothing like getting a good stiff invitation, especially when the guest of honour is the world's only party-going stiff.
Behind the portico of University College London, Jeremy Bentham's getting ready for a party. Life's pretty quiet when you've been dead for 160 years, so an annual bash is something to look forward to. A quick dusting down and it's open house.
I've heard of party poopers, but this is ridiculous.
Oh, we're always delighted to see Jeremy Bentham. I think because of the eccentricity of his will and wanting to remain in a box and be mummified.
It's quite something to have a real memento of the great man himself.
Well, you know, he looks better every time. I think I get worse and worse, and he looks much better.
He was just painting, and that's his statement, the probably is the thing. And then he was saying, stick me in a box and show me off to the world, I don't care.
Some philosophy catches on, some doesn't. Jeremy believed in life after death as a mummy keeping your family company. He coined a word for it, auto-icon. In time, he thought whole family collections could be built up.
Bentham carried out some experiments to see which would be the best way of preserving his head. And he learnt about the ways in which the Maoris of New Zealand baked heads in order to preserve them. And there seems to be some evidence that he undertook experiments with heads.
So did it work?
The mummification of the head was not terribly successful, and the skin turned black and the features were very shriveled. Eddie had a wax head modelled, and that was placed on top of the auto-icon instead.
And as for his eyes?
He had glass eyes made, modelled upon his own eyes several years before he died. The story goes that he used to carry these around with him, just in case he should drop dead.
Lovely party, Jeremy. Thanks. See you next year. Mummies hang out in exotic places. No, don't pack for Egypt. We're off to Greenland via a garage in North Carolina.
In southern states of America, they've got a saying, take your shoes to the menders and no one will mind if you forget to go back for them. But don't ever do it with a body at the undertaker's. Yet that's just what someone did at the McDougald Funeral Home in Laurinburg, North Carolina. The body belonged to a fairground worker, Concetto Farmica, murdered in 1911. Because no one in Laurinburg could pronounce his name, he was nicknamed Spaghetti. After his death, he was taken to the McDougald Funeral Home.
Concetto's father then came and made some preliminary arrangements. He made a down payment and then left and promised to return. And from that point on, there was no further contact with the family.
So they hung Spaghetti on the embalming room wall, but he soon got in the way. Next stop, the garage. One Halloween, the funeral home's owner dared the kids to spend 5 minutes in the dark there with Spaghetti. a boy called Doug took up the challenge.
And you could hear Doug out here in this garage breathing heavy. And every once in a while when he would turn and get a little nervous, you could hear his skin squeak on top of that hearse. Unknown to Doug, the funeral owner had rigged up an intercom. Suddenly, Spaghetti started to speak. Doug! And you heard this little voice in the back go, "What's that?" "Let me out!" And when he said that, you could hear Doug come off the hood of that hearse, squeak, wham on him! And he hit the wall. "Let me out of here!" Bam, 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 bam. And he hit that door, and of course he was out of there and gone. But after more than 70 years in a garage, Spaghetti was finally buried. A rumour went round town that the funeral expenses were met by a well-known Italian organisation.
It is possible that the Italian mafia paid for the funeral, but only my father and his sister, who were running the funeral home at the time, and the persons who were responsible for it, my dad, and that secret has gone to the grave with them.
So did it worry you having an unburied body hanging around for all that time?
When you grow up with a mummy in your garage, well, you don't think anything unusual about it. It was just another dead body in the funeral home.
There's not a pyramid in sight at Nuuk, capital of Greenland, and the nearest Faroes are some islands 700 miles away. But as mummies go, the ones in the National Museum of Greenland are, well, the daddies of them all. The bodies are Inuit, the people who settled in Greenland more than 1,000 years ago. 2 hunters found them in 1972, buried beneath a cliff, 6 women and 2 children. They died around 1475 from disease, food poisoning, or in a shipwreck. No one can tell. But the greatest discovery of all went almost unnoticed. "We saw a doll which had fallen to the side," said one hunter, but it turned out to be a little child. Holding the baby today is museum curator Joel Berglund.
They are so well preserved because they were found under a cliff, under a nose of a cliff, you can say, in stone-built graves. There were access for the wind to blow freely through the stones, and also a good drainage, so that the liquids from the bodies could drain away and the wind could dry up the bodies.
Freeze-dried sounds very modern. What else do you know?
The clothing is very interesting because it is the first time we have Eskimo clothing of that age. And it is very interesting to look at the fashion, the boots, the small pants, and the anoraks, and also to analyze how many different animals that have been involved in delivering skins and furs for the clothing.
But I think they found 8 mummies, so why only 3 on show?
We do not want to have too many dead bodies in the museums. It reminds maybe too much of a morgue, and that is not the idea.
But it's impossible not to wonder how these mummies died, especially the baby only 6 months old. Could it have been killed on purpose, as Inuit custom dictated, because its mother had died and no longer could care for it? Though they still have the lips to speak, the mummies of Greenland are not saying. In part 2, the curious quest continues with the body in the belfry, the pungent mystery of Jimmy Garlic.
I've met Sylvia, Sylvester and Spaghetti. Are all mummies stuck with nicknames for all eternity?
In London, there's a mummy hidden in this tower. The church is called St. James's Garlic Hithe, so what better name for the stiff in the steeple than Jimmy Garlic?
And here he is. This is our friend Jimmy Garlic, who's been with us for 200 or 300 years. Yes, he's all there. He's all there. He's got his, what do you call that?
Adam's apple.
Adam's apple as well, yeah.
Jimmy's identity remained a mystery until, after more than 300 years, he was restored. Then the truth came out in the wash.
He was given an acidic clean, and by using cotton wool on the end of cocktail sticks, he was gently wiped so the surface dirt was removed from him. It was only when those remains were sent off to the British Museum to be conserved and cleaned that back came the report that what we were looking at were the remains of a young man who had died in the last quarter of the 17th century.
So why was he so well preserved?
England was experiencing pronounced cold snaps. The body would not have had a chance to have decomposed, and what we are looking at is a naturally preserved skeleton covered in skin.
The date of Jimmy's death was the key to the mystery. A plaque in the church below told the sad tale of Seagrave Chamberlain. He died in 1675.
But hold on, so had the mummy.
The experts confirmed this couldn't be a coincidence.
In 1675, that same date, the absolute pinpoint spot on for the remains could have been erroneously known, sadly, as Jimmy Garlic for all of those years.
What can you make with these? Some smoke? Some sugar? Mummy's the word.
If you go to the University of Maryland, you might think there's something rather yummy about a mummy. In charge of an extraordinary collection of mummified body parts is Dr. Ron Wade.
The techniques themselves weren't published. One thing we do know is that the preservation process was using salt and sugar curing in order to desiccate and to dry.
Mummies made with sugar, how sweet.
Here we have a specimen of the head, including the cervical vertebrae. This is part of the liver here, actually. This particular specimen even has a tattoo on it. He was being robbed at the time. All right, put your hands up.
These strange sugar-cured mummies were a desperate measure. A Scottish doctor dreamt up the recipe because he needed bodies for his students to study, a problem in the 1790s.
The only access, legal access, they had to bodies for teaching anatomy in the medical schools were actually condemned prisoners who were going to be executed. And at that point they were given legal title to use those bodies as specimens in the anatomy labs. It was also an era of grave robbery, for example. In Glasgow, Scotland, they had, in some cemeteries of the affluent, they had guards that actually would guard the cemeteries on a 24-hour basis to prevent their loved one from being unearthed and from visiting the anatomy labs.
But as any cook knows, sugar soon turns brittle. Faced with crumbly corpses, Dr. Wade replaced them with more flexible friends made of plastic.
And basically, plastination is a process where you're actually removing the water from the tissue and replacing the space that was occupied by the water with silicone. This is a real human anatomical specimen that's been plastinated. But here you can see this is a sagittal section of a head. You can see the frontal sinus, you can see other sinuses, you can see the brain. You can even see that this person had a gold crown. You can see the crown on the tooth itself.
With plastination, the specimen is flexible enough to allow students to practice surgical procedures again and again.
Dr. Wade, you have an enviable collection.
Well, you're getting your share of bodies today, aren't you?
Sugar, plastic. In New Guinea, they do things quite differently.
As I came round the corner, I saw the row of smoked mummies held up. They sit them in baskets, in sort of wickerwork kind of baskets, which is a sort of V-shaped conical basket on a pole, and then they lean them all up against the cliff to keep them out of the damp and the wet. But most striking is the skin, I guess, and the way they sit crouched in their baskets, every limb simply folded, sitting there at rest. The physical process of smoking a mummy is that after the person's dead, firstly you need to get rid of the putrefying liquids, the sort of decomposition stuff. And so the body's put out in the forest while those liquids come out of it. Then it's like it's reached a cleaner stage when it's taken into the smokehouse, and then, slightly like you'd cook a ham or something like that, you smoke the body. Of course, depending on the weather, is the amount of time it takes to smoke cure the body. It can be done quite quickly if it's bright, sunny, dry, breezy, all that kind of weather. It can take as little as 6 weeks to smoke cure, but it can take several months if it's the rainy season.
So doctors in the past relied on body snatchers for corpses for their experiments, but in Philippi, West Virginia, I hear it was never a problem for one balmy embalmer.
100 years ago, you had to be crazy to live here. Then, this insane asylum was where families put their relatives. For the out of mind, this was a place where patients stayed out of sight. Sometimes they were literally forgotten about forever. Even when they died, they stayed unclaimed. By gruesome chance, a doctor there was experimenting on preserving bodies.
He had experimented on small animals such as squirrels and rabbits and birds and things of that kind. And then about 1888, he decided he would like to see if he could mummify people.
The unclaimed bodies were just what he needed.
Thank you for bringing your town's dark past out into the daylight.
These people that went to the insane asylum were sent there by their relatives, and back in the last century it was considered a disgrace to have anybody in your generation who was crazy. So when these people lived there, they weren't visited or anything, and when they died, the people at the asylum would call and say, "Come and get your bodies," but the people didn't want them because they said, "You just go ahead and bury them yourself." So that's how Mr. Hamrick was able to get these several bodies that he mummified.
Philippi's two mummies have had a busy life since they died. They've toured the world, and even now they're still on the road.
I've heard of a place with a weird collection. Every toy ever made, every little doll, every little figure. And one which was once a living person. Or was he? I want to meet Olaf. They say he's the world's tallest mummy. But what's he doing here, and is he for real? Do I detect another collector?
He supposedly was dug up out of a peat bog in Norway back in 1888. He was purchased from a large circus company like Barnum and Bailey, and it might have been Barnum and Bailey, and he was in a circus tent, and they made lots of money off him over many years. On the circus tent it says that he's 9 foot tall. We actually measured him, and he's like 9'6". And underneath the fur, he's definitely all man. We've kept him covered up. He is really dried out, but supposedly peat has a lot of formaldehyde in it, so it preserves the body. And there's been a lot of controversy about Olaf over the years because of some of the circuses where they'll try to make something bigger than it really is or whatever. And in this case, it's been said that there was a section of his leg that they thought, one person looking at it thought that there was a 4-inch section added to it to make him the tallest man ever known. And if in fact, I don't know if that's true or not, is all I know is he has an earring, which is interesting, a leather earring that has a bone on the end of it, and he was wearing moccasins when he died, and his moccasins are still embedded in his feet, which are really interesting. There's all his toenails and fingernails are still there. He still looks pretty good for as old as he is. I know that of my collection of more than 1 million items now, I know most of my things are pretty well authenticated. Olaf, whether he is or whether he isn't, he's very controversial, and I just kind of enjoy having him around. It really doesn't matter to me. I'm not selling him, so I don't have to prove anything to anybody.
In the next program, the collector returns. The quarry and the quest will be different, but one thing will never change. The collector's dedication to gathering the oddest, the strangest, the most incredible that our planet has to offer. Prepare to be surprised.